Okay, so welcome to the PGS debate over the upcoming EU referendum. I personally am on the side in that I believe that we should leave the EU for a number of reasons. Although Europe itself is a great thing, I believe that the EU has now become far too big to cope and to manage and is currently being led by an overpowering German force, and that we would be better off outside.
My view would be that we should stay in the EU. The EU is an important group of countries that helps us assert our authority on the world stage, and also helps us within trading and just in terms of so many social aspects as well. However, I do think there should be some reform into how we function within the EU and how the EU functions as a whole, as it can become quite a clunky bureaucratic system that can be limiting to the countries within it.
And I'll be really supporting the idea that the EU is a great institution, and that if anything we should move more into integrating within the EU, and so effectively I'll be saying why we should be staying in the upcoming referendum in June. So do you want to just
If I explore, so in my recent article about the EU and my personal views, I broke the argument down into three key points: sovereignty, migration, and safety. Now, sovereignty. At this current time, approximately 60% of the laws imposed in our country are being made by an unelected and undemocratic European Union. If you ask many of the people who their MEPs are in this country, if you ask many of the people who the important figures within the European Commission are in this country, I would challenge both of you to name any people that could actually name these people, and also how they got chosen. It's my personal view that they are simply people with big political interests, former presidents, former prime ministers, some of them with big business affiliations, and I don't believe that that's right, and that these people should be running a total of 28 different countries and effectively governing how very different economies. You cannot compare the economy of Greece to the economy of Germany to the economy of Romania, and effectively amalgamating them into one, where none of the country's personal interests are actually adhered to.
I think you'll find MEPs are elected, and although our system for electing MEPs is not perfect, I'll admit that. And I think part of the problem of that is that our country and our government don't feel committed enough to the EU to engage the population enough within that voting system. I think if there was more engagement about the effect of voting in your MEP and that system, then we'd have enough people voting in the MEPs for it to feel like a more democratic system. Admittedly, we do not have a say over who's voted in from other countries, but I think that if you'll find that a majority of the laws are things that we would have passed ourselves, maybe not in exactly the same wording or exactly the same capacity, but it's progressive laws that we would be introducing ourselves.
So I would like to concur with both of you actually on this point about the fact that MEPs are nobody really knows who they are, and I would agree with you completely on that. However, I don't feel that's like a dictatorship in a sense that we don't know who our MEP is. Instead, we should really look towards educating. We should stay in the EU first, and then we start educating the public, and we allow them to recognise how important these MEPs are, what actually the implication of electing a certain MEP is, and how they can help change the laws in our country. But just, I'd like to go again to what you said about the laws, and I do agree with you that a vast majority of our laws are now made in the EU. However, I challenge that this is a bad thing. Most of these laws are actually helping workers' rights, they're helping protect the environment, they're helping protect consumers, and many of the laws to do with health and safety. So I really don't see why, one, this is a big problem, and two, why we should be scared of this. If these laws have been created to help protect you, help make sure the car you're buying is not going to crash, or make sure the airbags function properly, or for certain workers not to work too many hours a week, or so we can stop climate change, I really don't see why there's a problem. So I do recognise that people do have a problem, a general problem with creating laws in other countries having been imposed on us. However, I do think these laws are good, and they help be progressive and help us change the country to be more forward-thinking and international.
I agree to an extent, but when does one law become two laws, become thousands of laws? You're looking recently, people are coming out and saying, if we were to leave the EU, workers would not have their rights, we would not be able to go on paid holidays, and just building upon how if we were to leave the EU, all of these workers' rights that were built up for years and years would all suddenly be gone. The reality is, Chamberlain, after the Second World War, he introduced paid working holidays, straight away. And again, there are just a number of laws that were in place before the EU. And another big issue that gets brought up is farmers and how the EU helps farmers a lot. And the NUF recently came out as saying that the farming institution would be better off within the EU. But the reality is that these laws, farming went on before we were in the EU. And these laws, they just seem to be overtaking the effective best interests of the nation. I again, drawing back to the 28 nations, how are we meant to have a cohesive and efficient single economy, effectively, with 28 different countries all trying to compete over the laws that best suits their own country?
I would argue that you've had a similar situation in the United States of America for the last 200 years, where you have 50 different states, many with completely different climates, completely different natural resources, completely different ways of functioning, and they've all been competing for federal law. And actually, although there has been problems, I think that has overall been a successful system. I don't think that the EU should strive to be more like the United States of America. I think that it is a good system as it is at the moment. I think though that a lot of these laws are positive things, and that we have contributed to them. I think if you could name me more laws that were negative and that were detrimental to our own country than those that were positive, then I could see an issue with it. But the fact of the matter is that actually many of these laws are things that we probably would have introduced ourselves, but what we're doing instead is we're helping other countries that do need these laws to introduce them, and we're making sure that they're introduced in our own country.
Quickly, I don't mind if you can obviously go back to this topic, but I think we move to the economy and the issues surrounding the economy, because this is obviously a very key area. Yeah. I'd just like to start off, if I may. I think it's pretty much absolute that most international organisations are suggesting that we stay in the European Union. We've had Barack Obama today suggesting that it's actually the UK needs to stay in the EU, if not to maintain its economic status, but also to maintain its influence. We have an influence on the largest consumer body in the world. We have an influence on this respected and well-funded the European Union. But I just want to go into some stats, for example. I mean, this came up in the article a lot. We have a good debate about this, but we do export 55%, and that was the statistic used in the booklet sent out, and that's from the ONS. 55% of our exports go to the EU. However, 8% of the EU exports come to us. This is from the ONS. So I really don't see how, if we're going to take ourselves out of the EU, take ourselves out of a free trade deal, that when we put two fingers up to them, in a sense, using the words I did in the article, they're going to allow us to have a free trade deal which doesn't really benefit them. I'd obviously like to hear your viewpoint on that.
I think when we drag this into statistics, I think we have to look at George Osborne coming out and saying, okay, every single family will be £4,300 worse off by 2030 if we were to leave the European Union. Now, if you actually went into those figures, it turns out that we would grow by 37% by 2030 if we were still in the EU, 29% if we were outside the EU. He has then transferred that difference in percentage and combined that with GDP, and has effectively made GDP per capita, so GDP per every single person in the country. There is no link between GDP per capita and income. GDP can be used to pay off the deficit, pay off national debt, improve our rail services, roads. Yes, there will have a minor effect on our lives, but to brand it as being £4,300 worse off per family is, I believe, a total manipulation of the figures.
I think what he's doing here, I agree that he's divided GDP and divided by the population and said this is how much each person is technically going to lose. But I think he's done that purely to reinforce the point. And he's not explicitly suggesting that the Smiths from Hatfield will lose £4,200 by the time we get to 2030. He's not doing that. He's suggesting that this is the kind of impact leaving the EU will have. I mean, I think it's very clear that growth will decrease, and what decrease in GDP does mean is that we're going to have higher unemployment, we're going to really reduce our trade, we're going to have lower incomes generally across the economy. So we really do need to look at the actual true figures if we leave the EU. I know at the moment it's all speculation. It can only be speculation.
Yes, exactly.
However, but most of the studies by the IMF, by the Bank of England, by the government have suggested that we'll be worse off. So I just don't see the reason for leaving the EU. Why leave something where we're going to be worse off? Why leave a job when you're earning a lovely salary and you're integrating with the rest of the world. I just don't see the.
And also, I would argue that actually there's numbers and there's figures and there's stats that go either way. There's reports that say we should stay. There's reports that say we should leave. And I think that actually, in some ways, that amount of option and that amount of stats is unhelpful. I think when you look at it, it's not just about the economy. And although that is important, I feel like either way, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We might leave and the economy might bomb. We might leave and the economy might be booming. And it's the same as if we stay. I think what you need to look at is socially, is it positive for us to stay in the EU? And I would argue yes, in terms of the fact that many of the laws introduced are positive for us, but also in terms of migration. Not only are immigrants coming to our country a positive for our economy, but also the amount of immigrants that we have in other countries within the EU, and how those laws protect those people who are British but who are also living and working in these other countries within the EU.
I think we should most definitely move on to migration at some point. But may I just go back to Osborne? He neglected to say that we would still be growing by 29% if we were outside of the EU. He has really made this very clear that he wants to stay in. But moving on to migration, you talk of lower unemployment and how the economy will be. I'm not going to come here and say that, migrants steal UK jobs, they're bad for the economy, they scrounge off benefits. I don't think that is what very, very few people on the Leave campaign are actually saying. However, there is basic economics here. If you have a large number of people coming in each year, currently at over 300,000, it is going to put pressure on public services. There is no denying that. It's going to put pressure on the NHS. We've already seen recently in this last week that it's putting pressure on places for primary schools. And also, in terms of jobs, lower unemployment. If you have too many people willing to carry out the same job, wages are going to fall. There is an oversupply of labour, and that is forcing wages down, meaning that citizens over here are not willing to go out and work because they feel that they were better off just taking benefits. Whereas these migrants coming from countries, Romania, our living wage that's being introduced this year, and it's just going to rise and rise, that is 6 times the minimum wage of Romania. These people, I'm not saying that they don't have a right to come across, but it is having an economic impact and it is having an effect on unemployment in this country.
So I would just comment on that, and then I'll just use this as my closing statement just to wrap it up as well. I just want to pick out on, say, immigrants. Okay, they take our jobs. That's the best we can get from UKIP. Okay, and I just don't think it's true. I think a stat which I also got earlier, ONS again. I'll find this the actual source if you want me to. Is 20 billion is the net contribution of migrants. 20 billion. So that means that's including everything they're taking out through the NHS, all the resources they're using up, all the primary school places they're taking up. Migrants don't come here, sit about on their arse all day, and then go to the NHS when they've broken them up. No, what they do is they pay in taxes, they send money back to their families in Europe, and they try and integrate with the society. They don't really want to be here, I'm sorry. They want to support their families in other countries, and they want to get back to their cultural home, they want to get back to their friends. So the only reason they're coming here is to get a bit of money, work as hard as they damn well can, and come back. So I just don't think that this huge influx of migrants is affecting the NHS, because they are offsetting the cost they're bringing to our economy and our services through the taxes they pay. They are a great asset to our economy, and I applaud them for coming here. And I think we should also use this as a two-way system. So just to close up, I think the EU is great for the economy, it's great for jobs. I think migration is a great thing for the UK. It's a great net 20 billion. That's what migration brings in, 20 billion to us. And just to finish off, I think the EU is a great institution, and I think you should all vote to stay in on the 23rd of June. I just closing statements.
You give a closing statement because I pretty much agree with everything.
Fair enough.
Just said.
Well, I don't think you can honestly put a financial number on the pressure that's being felt by the NHS. My mum personally is having a torrid time due to not only underfunding, but because of the sheer numbers of people that she is having to deal with on a daily basis. The population is increasing at a growing rate, and it will continue to grow. And the fact that David Cameron came out and saying he wants to reduce net migration to 100,000 a year, if you were to put that into perspective, 100,000 a year as opposed to over 300,000 that we are at now, when there is a humanitarian crisis like we have in Syria at the moment, We have taken, I think we're intending to take approximately 20,000 migrants. We would be able to take 200,000 people who are fleeing for their lives. We would be able to take them directly out of the conflict instead of forcing them through an economically ravaged Greece where there's no effective safety protocols, and as shown by Europol, up to 5,000 members of ISIS have potentially taken advantage of this situation. We would be able to take 200,000 people out of Syria, take them into our country before we even got to the levels of net migration that we're at right now. So before, yes, you can argue in terms of statistics, 20 billion, but you have to put just general numbers of people and how much our economy as a whole can cope with. I think the In campaign are very, very cynical in how outside of the EU, our trade deals, our relationships will just fall apart. And I think that outside the EU, we would in fact be able to do a better job than we are doing right now.
Thank you very much.
We probably need to finish
Thank you.
there, but thank you very much indeed.